Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today and to speak a little bit about the Institute of Gender and Health, CIHR, and to try and thread a few examples into some of the things that we're talking about. The Institute of Gender and Health, really mirrors, as it should, CIHR's wider mandate. But I guess that the thing that's a little bit different is that we really do focus on girls and women and men and boys across the life course. So that's really the core business. Anything that's impacting around gender and sex, we're kind of interested in exploring and developing those. And again, it's about better understanding the issues. The Institute is 11 years old. It's done some wonderful descriptive work in terms of funding some wonderful descriptive work, but certainly is invested in moving towards interventions and influencing policy. Our catch cry is every cell is sexed and every person is gendered. And so one of the other things we often say is that, gender and sex are everybody's business, everybody's work. So gender, just by way of some working definitions, gender is a social construction. It encompasses roles, identities and relations. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, in terms of gender relations, we might talk about women's health issues, we might talk about men's health issues, but rarely are they that compartmentalised. In fact, they're relational, they often work in with one another, and the things that impact men and women in different ways still have implications for the people and the families around them. It is linked to power and economic and social status. In preparing for the talk today, I review some of the workplace issues, and women are still paid less than men. It's around 17%, and depending on where you read. And so again, when we link gender, we often talk about power and economic advantage around that. So it certainly works in with it, and cultural and temporally specific. And as an advantage, as an illustrative example of that, rather, I was struck by this photograph. It's been one of my favourite photographs for a long time. It was taken in 1932 in Manhattan, and it's 11 workers, and the name of it's called Lunchtime Atop a Skyscraper. And I think it's just a reminder of how gendered work can be. They look kind of interactive to me. They look like they're connecting, and depending on where you read, there's a suggestion that it was staged. It looks a little staged to me, but certainly it's sort of interactive. These guys are kind of working together, 840 odd feet above the skyline there. Kind of interesting how they connect. And then this 1947 picture is at a biscuit factory in the United Kingdom at Wright's Biscuits, or Cookies. And the women are on the assembly line here packaging the cookies. And I'm struck by, the difference here. They're all wearing the same uniform. Their eyes are down, they're subverted. You could even say they're slightly submissive in how they're being depicted there in the picture. It's interesting how gender and health and work have always been segregated. There's always been a kind of a division of labour. And we try to interrogate that. We try to say, let's think about doing business differently. Let's think about what we could do to help people think differently about what's available to them. The interesting one, you're man enough to be a nurse. Having been in the industry for many, many years, it's still 87% of the nurses in Canada are female. We really haven't managed to engage too many guys in this occupation. And similarly, women in science and mathematics, we like to bring them in, like to encourage them to come into some of those areas. And there have been some concerted efforts, but again, we're certainly a long way off the 50-50 split. So even those old photographs from 1932 and 47, we sort of go, oh, the world's changed. But in some ways, the divisions of labour still prevail. I'll give you an example around gender as well. You've got a very, very talented PhD student out of the University of Laval called Philippe Roy. And I was fortunate enough to see him present at the Institute of Gender and Health, their conference, just this month past here in Montreal. And he presented some really interesting work about male farmers and suicide. And what Philippe's done his approach is he's looked at suicide rates in Quebec by region, and he said, well, you know, in rural Quebec, the suicide rates are much higher. So that was his first kind of pass. He looks at that. And then he says, but if you look at the male farmers, and W farmers is women farmers, and you look about this is the reported levels of psychological stress and suicidal ideation, so suicidal thoughts amongst farmers, you'll find that, you know, compared to the general population, certainly farmers do report more psychological distress, slightly higher suicidal ideation, but of course the women are actually reporting more psychological distress than the male farmers. So what he's decided to do is basically investigate the differences in these suicide rates amongst men, male farmers, but he's doing it by looking at distress. So he's going and he's interviewed 31 farmers across Quebec, male farmers, about some of their issues around what stresses them, what are some of their self-management strategies, how do they deal with the social isolation, and working through some of the gender issues. So it's a gender analysis about where this distress comes from, what their reticence might be about reporting it, because we know guys typically don't as often go to family physicians and report mental health issues. So it's kind of interesting. He's got a very nice approach to this, and I think it's going to be great work. So sex, by contrast, so what Philippe is doing is a gendered analysis. He's looking at masculine ideals and why farmers might be reticent to seek help, why they might be more prone to suicide and less likely to report psychological distress. Sex, by contrast, is a biological construct. It's around hormones, genes, anatomy, physiology, and so forth. I think what's important to remember with sex is that, you know, we often think about it as kind of unitary, like men are this and women are that, and that's the difference point or the comparison point. There's great diversity within sex and how people function are put together physiologically and anatomy-wise as well. There's difference in drug absorption, body composition, metabolism. There's so many differences within sex. So there's a fellow who's out of New York, and he's looking at male suicide and sex. And so this is interesting work as well, because oftentimes what we try to do is we try to say the best design for a gender and sex study is to include both approaches rather than relying on one. So Leo Scher is very interesting. He's saying that testosterone has effect on mood and consequently suicidality. So if you've got low testosterone amongst depressed men, it is a pathway to suicide. His second hypothesis is that testosterone has effect on cognition and consequently suicidality. So if you've got low testosterone, you have reduced cognitive function. So it increases the chances of suicide. And if you have means, then it certainly does. And by that I mean access to firearms, so in the case of farmers. And his third hypothesis is that testosterone affects aggression and consequently suicidality. So high levels of testosterone increases aggression. And so again, with means that there's more completers depending on their testosterone level. So if Leo was working with Philip, they'd design a study that would not only involve the gender aspects of talking to farmers about psychological distress, it would also involve a sex component where we'd be drawing off blood samples to look at testosterone levels. And it's one of the things that, you know, the Institute of Gender and Health is very interested in, because it's hard, it's difficult work to do, because it tries to bring these two, you know, different aspects together. And we do work very hard at trying to do that. So we have operational conflation. I was reading a European report about women in the workplace, and they use gender in lieu of sex and vice versa. So it's used interchangeably, and often we do. But I think it's really worth thinking about them separately, not in a competing paradigm, but in terms of bringing them together. So the dimensions of gender, sometimes we're struck by trying to measure gender, so the BEM index, the conformity to masculine norms index, so we might have an idea that we can measure some of those things. And then we also have challenges accounting for sex, because much of the animal model work is done on male mice. And so we don't really even come at it from a point of disaggregating by sex. So there's a lot of issues in both camps around, trying to work together within it. There's a really nice paper that I read out of 2010, and it was, I think it's Coates. It's a Quebecian researcher, and it's around rehabilitation. It was a literature review. And they do a very, very nice job of talking about rehabilitation, musculoskeletal pain and rehabilitation and return to work. And what they point out very articulately is, neither sex nor gender fully explains everything. So, it needs to be a combined approach to better advance that work. In terms of women's health, I looked, for an example that I might be able to thread into the conversation today, and I went back to your report of 2007, the difficulty of balancing work and family life, impact on the physical and mental health of Quebecian families. And so what I noticed is, there's a much higher rate. There's more and more women in the workforce, in the labour market. They're highly represented in the service sector. They have many more atypical jobs, and by that I mean part-time jobs. Also, around shift work, they're far more likely to be working in shift work. They talk about work-family conflict within this report in fairly nuanced ways. I think it was a very sophisticated report. And also that there's high stress levels amongst women in trying to do some of that balance, the paid work and the unpaid work, and reduce mental and physical health for many of the women who are in work. Then I went to the Women in Canada agenda-based report, and this one was interesting too, because traditional occupations for women, teaching in 2009, 76% of the teachers were women, and that's actually increased over the last few years, up a couple of percent. Nursing and related, as I said, it continues to increase. It's gone from 8.3% to 9.1%. It's 87% of the nurses are female. Sales and services have dropped a little bit by 1.2%, but still women are highly represented in those groups. Clerks and administrators, 76% of the people who are in those jobs are women. And women are more likely to have left their job because of family or personal responsibilities. So it's interesting how we position it. I drew this one as well. I was interested about this because when you look at the statistics around Quebec and you look at women in particular, you can see since 1976, there's been an increase in the percentage of women 15 and up who are in employment. And it's a good news story. It's roughly 20% increase. So we've got far more women in the workplace. And then if you look at unemployment, you start to go, okay, so there's a trend in unemployment for women just as there is with men. And so sometimes we fall into a little bit of a trap. We start saying, oh well, it's more acute for men. It's actually impacting men in higher numbers. So what I'd encourage people to do, and I often do this, is to say, let's have a look within the category of women, or let's have a look within the category of men and not get into the comparison. Let's just look at that and try and understand it, because there is a rise in unemployment for women here. So if you look at it by age, during the recent labour market downturn, the unemployment for young women, 25 and down, has increased from 10% to 12.4% in a year, 2008 through 2009. So I'd lay that piece out first. Then I'd say by location, women in Atlantic provinces and Quebec generally have higher unemployment rates than women in the other provinces. And then by ethnicity, in 2009, 51% of the total foreign-born female population was employed, compared to 60.6% of women born in Canada. And indeed, if you've been here less than 5 years as an immigrant woman, your employment rate will be running around 49.1% compared to the 60% overall. So it's just to say that within the categories of gender and sex and how we talk about men and women, It's important not to fall into comparisons every time between men and women. Sometimes it's so important to get into the category, subdivide, look at subgroups, and work into a nuanced, understanding of the issues and the problems that reside for men and women. Clearly, we do look at, we often position these as difference. And again, as an example of what we might like to think about, men do die earlier than women overall, and it's 4.7 years. But 20-some years ago, it was 7.4 years. The gap is closing, and we're all living longer. I think some questions could be asked of that data. And if you look at the reasons why men die 4.7 years earlier than women, in order, it's cardiovascular disease, suicide, motor vehicle accidents, infectious diseases, most often HIV-related, and liver failure, most often secondary to alcohol use. So again, if your analysis is just a little bit deeper and gets below the public positioning of men v women's health, it's far more nuanced in what you can talk about, how you can think about it. Women experience a heavier burden of chronic illness by many measures. And again, those things are really worth thinking about in terms of which are those diseases, what are the issues, and how do we help people in their workplaces address those issues. And the use of healthcare services differ also. But again, just to say, we lose men to the healthcare service. So fewer men than women go to a family physician or a general practitioner ages 25 through 50 because they're at work generally. And that's part of the reason, even when you control for obstetrics and gynecological consultations. But if you look at every emergency room department across Canada, you'll find men are overrepresented by about 2%. So they do see doctors. They usually see them later in the illness. It's usually about injury. So again, just to try and get a bit of a nuanced understanding of some of the differences and to focus on those. And they do respond differently to therapies. One of the other things, when I was putting this together, I was sort of thinking, the workplace is a fascinating place for health. And I understand it's about occupational health and safety in many cases, but there seems to be amazing opportunities to also engage around health promotion. So this is just one initiative that's coming out of the United States, and it's been targeted at African-American fellas who go to the African-American men who go to the barber shop. I'm not so sure they go necessarily entirely for hair. I think a lot of it's about social connection. And so what they're saying is you can do these blood pressure checks and you can do these blood sugar level checks with these guys who are, gathering in these places. So the workplace, in some ways, although it's not directly intervening, it becomes a venue where health promotion can happen. So I just put it forward as an example, and I just draw your attention to the fact they say free diabetes and high blood pressure screenings. And I think that's very interesting language because they problematise the issue. It's about diabetes, it's about high blood pressure. So it's not just about, having it something checked. So I think it's a very interesting area that we could think about in the future. There are some unique questions that need to be addressed, no doubt. And as we mentioned, gender and sex is everybody's business. So I think that if we can account for gender and sex in the workplace, it will actually help us to advance the work, and also I think it will help people in terms of health. I think our interventions then become a little bit more strategic, a little bit more targeted, and have a better chance of helping people. Merci. Thank you for the opportunity to chat, and I hope it's been helpful, and be delighted to take any questions. Thank you.